Okay, should we make a start? Whole desk collapses underneath me. How many of you here have worked with kids who have autism or adults with autism in the past or are currently? Yes, you are. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, so quite a few of you. So please stick your hand up, add to the discussion, because we all learn from you guys as well. Do you all work with kids rather than adults? You work with adults. Teenagers. Cool. And is it an array of different abilities from profound all the way up to highly functioning? Highly functioning. Any of you work with profound kids with ASD? Okay. Just gives me a bit of an idea. We're going to start off. This is a very blended lecture. I will be using lots of different YouTube clips. We'll be doing some interactive stuff as well. So we're going to start off with just a quick little video, and let's hope it works.
This is the story of a boy who didn't talk for a long time.
Hold on.
The boy...
Hold on. Audio helps, doesn't it? That guy's got a wonderful Welsh accent. I can't get into it to put the subtitles on, so for the next one I will try. So we talked about neurodevelopmental disorders last week and the understanding that it is the neurons within our brain are just not firing like a neurotypical developing child would. Autism is particularly characterised by impairment with social interactions and communication. And that's not just verbal communication, it's social interaction and communication as well. And also behaviour. Now, I've worked with a lot of different autistic children over my career, and some of them have been profoundly autistic, whereas every other day they are banging their head against the wall, they're cutting themselves, you're calling the ambulance because there's nothing you can do. You're restraining them to help themselves because they are constantly doing some form of action to themselves that is really harmful. On the other hand, I've worked with kids who have absolutely no language at all, but are the happiest, the loveliest, the gentlest, the most beautiful people that you can come across. Every single autistic child is different, and that is why it's on a continuum. And we'll go into the details of why this is in a minute. So we're going to look at the history of autism first, because it has changed fundamentally in our understanding over the past 100 years. I've done it as a video, so you can go back and have a look. And this is the web page that I've got this from, but it's a really good site to go to. So I'll just flick off. Here we go, History of Autism. So over the past century, and we really are talking 100 years, that we've understood symptoms of, not classification of autism, but these children are different. This neurodevelopmental disorder has existed for a very long time. And it has changed due to our understanding, due to technology and the advances within technology. And because of these changes, there has been some real gross misunderstandings about what autism is, the prevalence of autism, the prognosis of autism, and how you get autism. So it really started, let's look at this first. Autism. It's on a spectrum, I think you all know that by now, from really the very mild to the extremely profound. It is problems with social communication and interaction across all contexts. It doesn't just happen at school, it doesn't just happen at home, it is across your life. It involves repetitive, restrictive behaviour patterns, RRBs, and activities and interests. Early onset, we know that actually by in vitro it is probably already taken control. And we'll talk about why that is in a minute. We also know that symptoms can, if not caught early enough, can cause major impairments to their social interactions and to the education. It's called a spectrum disorder, and we'll go into why it's called a spectrum disorder in a minute. But there really are a variety of influences that make each and every child different, which doesn't help us guys in trying to diagnose it and trying to understand it. So bear with us. Autism is just simply auto meaning self. It comes from the Greek. And it all started in about 1911 when Eugene, who was a psychiatrist, found these symptoms and decided that, actually, do you know what, they're probably related to schizophrenia. And this stuck for a very, very long time. They've always classified autism as part of this sort of schizophrenia continuum. In 1920, so, you know, going back quite a way, individuals thought it had something to do with what these children were eating, the gluten in their diets. And actually, to some extent, this has got a basis in science. A lot of children who are autistic have gastro and digestive issues. And you can see why this became apparent and people actually believe this was a cause. It's not a cause, but it is a symptom of. In the 1930s, they were quite radical in the way that they treated autism, and they used to do some ECT, sort of that electroconvulsive therapy. Apparently it still happens today. I hope it doesn't happen today. But we know, and technology's moved on, we can do all sorts of different types of transcranial magnetic resonating for autistic children, but mainly for depressed individuals. So although this is very old school, there could be some theory behind it. It wasn't until the 1940s that we really first started looking at autism as a social issue, that social communication, that interaction issue. And it was 1943 that the psychiatrist Kanner really took it to be a disorder in its own right. And he called it Kanner syndrome, which was later in the DSM-3 as early infant onset autism. And you can see at the same time, in 1944, Asperger coined the phrase Asperger syndrome. So everyone is beginning to say, hold on a minute, what is this? What are these symptoms? And this is where we have so many different ideas of what autism is. This is where the Asperger's came from, which is the highly functioning. They're really quite good at language and interaction, compared with what Kanner was seeing. And he was looking at the more profound individuals. This is where the diagnosis came from for pervasive developmental disorders, not otherwise specified, Rett syndrome. There were lots of different ideas about what autism was, and they're very specific in how they diagnosed it. Now, the DSM-5 now umbrellas that and puts it all into one category because it is so difficult and so unreliable to look at just Rett syndrome or autism or Asperger's syndrome. So it's far more reliable to put them all under the umbrella because we're picking up these children now. So 1943, 1944 was quite a big time of development with understanding the different symptoms within autism. By the 1950s, people were beginning to think it was parents, and they called it the refrigerator mother. They were blaming the environment for these symptoms, and the children were behaving in particular ways predominantly because of the mother. And so in the 60s, they tried some really great stuff. They gave these kids some LSD, some drugs to help with the behaviours and to alleviate the symptoms. And of course, it didn't really work. And it was in 1965 that Bernard Rimland, who was actually a psychiatrist, a psychologist, as well as a father of a child with autism, went, hold on a minute, it's not me. I'm not making my child autistic. It's not the environment I'm bringing this child up in. It's this child. You know, my other child is typically developing. They're fine. It's not me. So he was a real instigator in looking into, you know, what is it that is causing autism? And from then, you can see the research just kind of bloomed. The 1980s, we were looking at sensory issues, and lots of sensory rooms were coming out. This neurosensory therapy, lots of those bubble lights and dark rooms with calming music. By the 1990s, we were looking at holding therapy. And then we started looking at ABA therapy, applied behavioural analysis, DIR floor time, teach, and that we will go into next week. So we're going to talk about the treatments of the behaviours of autism next week. And today, really, there's a lot of different ways in which we understand autism, the symptoms of autism. We're getting very good at picking up on the differences of these children, but the reliability of our diagnosis is far better than it ever has been before. And I'm going to show you some research today that came out 3 months ago, which is just going to revolutionise the way in which we think about autism. Okay, this scrolls down and is really quite interesting, but I'm going to come back to this later. But it's a really interesting timeline of autism for you. As I said, the link is there on the PowerPoint. So we can see the spectrum from mild to severe. And those of us who have been working in autism quite a long time, we're still very set in our ways with kind of going, oh, well, Asperger's. And I think that's going to take a long time to kind of wear off. But the mild end is the end we would think of as being Asperger's. These children are highly functioning. They usually have high intelligence. They might be lacking in social skills and language, but at school they generally flourish. They get on really well. You can see that their social interactions are a little bit difficult, but in life generally they will cope. As we get into sort of the grey area, and this is what we were talking about last week when we were talking about the diagnosis in the DSM being categorical or continuous. Where does Asperger's finish and where does autism start? So this is why, again, we've got rid of these categories of autism and put them all together. So if we look at this middle bit here, these children are far better with visual information than abstract thinking. And you can understand that, can't you? The abstract thinking, the trying to think outside the box is very difficult for these children. They're lacking in understanding of emotions, and we'll go into detail of that today. Those of you who did undergrad psychology, think of theory of mind, and we'll go back to that in a minute. Lacking of social skills. They can't start a conversation. They don't want that reciprocity of language. They can't read body language. They have very, very poor social communication skills. They just don't read people like we would. And then we get to the severe, very low functioning. Most of them are non-verbal. Some of them will have some form of sign language. They'll be very more profound SIBs, so self-injurious behaviours, lots more repetitive behaviour, not just behaviour but speech as well, repetitive speech. And they are far more likely to have epilepsy, and we'll see the comorbidity of these disorders as we go through. But I do want you to start thinking about autism on this spectrum. So common aspects, we've mentioned these already, and I'm going to go into far more detail as we go through. Problems with social interaction. There is, your children, do they talk to you? If you ask them a question, would they say good morning to you? No. There's that real lack. They have difficulty of social interactions. Some parents of young children even say that, oh, I just thought my child was really shy. Yeah. The first symptom, just that none of that social interaction you would get with a normal child, none of that eye contact. We talked about this last week. Somebody asked me a question. Unusual objects. Always unusual objects. They are fascinated by air conditioning units, washing machines going round and round. They will play with toy cars, but they won't play with them like that. They'll spin the wheels. Yeah, they do things in a very different way, and we'll talk about why a bit later on. These children need the same clothes, the same foods, the same routines because of their anxieties. And again, we're going to go into all of that. Repeated body actions, movements, again, to reduce the anxiety. And unusual emotional reactions to things that we wouldn't even consider being an issue, they find it an issue because of their intensity of light, sound. Everything is just more intense. So they do cover their ears because it's too loud. So we're going to go into details of all of these. They're common. They're not in every child with autism. And they're certainly not to the same degree in every child with autism. So causes, we don't know, is the answer to that. However, it is a very complex genetic issue. And I've got some research in a minute that I think is just amazing that came out in 2016. We know about premature babies, for neurodevelopmental disorders in general. And we also know that some medications during pregnancy will lead you to have an autistic a child as well. So genes, let's take them in order. We know that ASD runs in families. Do any of your kids, do you know the parents?
Yeah.
Can you see the... You know, oh, yeah.
So
Yeah, it is obvious, isn't it? To you and I, because you know it's genetic, you kind of look at the parent and go, oh yeah, okay. Siblings as well, so identical twins, 77% likely to have two twins, identical twins with autism. Oh my word, what a life that would be if you had twins with autism, my goodness. Fraternal twins, dizygotic, 31%, and then siblings, 20%. It is all about the genes. Now, we know there is one gene for autism, and that is brilliant. But we also know that there are another 200 to 400 genes that mutate, that interact, that change, and that is why it's on a continuum, because every mutation is different. The severity will be different. And we'll come back to that in a minute. So this is some amazing research that has been done in 2016. And I think it really just goes to show that we are understanding the genetics behind autism in so much more detail than we ever used to. So older males are likely to have children or a child who has autism. As the sperm ages, you're more likely to get more mutations. Younger ladies, your eggs are not mature enough. They're having children with autism. We're seeing that if there's an age gap between the male and the female, the old sperm, the young egg, you're getting more mutations. You are more likely to have a child with autism. And also when you're both a little bit older as well. But the highest risk, 66%, is to do with males. The older the male, the older the sperm, the more likely you are to be getting these genetic mutations. So this, I think, is absolutely fascinating, and potentially while the prevalence rate is going up, because more older males are having babies with second marriages, and young ladies, young teenagers are also having babies earlier than before. So that could be one issue. So issues in pregnancy. We know that any baby born preterm is going to have issues because the brain hasn't developed yet. And if there are stressful issues, this really does lead to the baby's brain just not developing. And it's not just autism. We're talking about intellectual disabilities. We're talking about ADHD. We're talking about specific learning disabilities as well. So really, the development within the womb, that baby, that brain, is so delicate that this is leading to autism. And of course, technological advances, we are keeping babies alive that would not necessarily have survived. From 25 weeks now, 28 weeks, they're viable. Yeah, so their brains just aren't developing inside the womb, it's outside, and that is leading to issues. We know that things like sodium valproate do lead to particularly autism in children. So drugs during pregnancy changes the way those neurons are developing. What is interesting though is there's no conclusive evidence at all about pollution and ADSD or infections and ADSD. Nothing at all. So I think that's actually quite interesting. Misconceptions, and there are a lot. There is no evidence at all on the MMR vaccine. In fact, any vaccine, and I'll show you a paper in a minute. We know that upbringing, parents have absolutely nothing to do with creating an autistic child. Okay, it's not in the parenting. And we also know it is not in the diet. It is not something that they have eaten, which is creating this autistic tendency. It is to do with the genetics and the development during pregnancy, and sometimes actually during birth as well, with asphyxiation, lack of oxygen as well. So this is a really interesting paper. The QR code is there if you want to just have a quick flick through now. It came out in 2014 and it looked at over 1.2 million children. That's a lot of children. And they were looking at whether vaccines had any link at all with autism. And they found nothing. They found no link at all. And they looked at the MMR vaccine, which is measles, mumps and rubella. And they also looked at the mercury and, I can never pronounce it, thimerosal. Is that right? Nothing at all came up in 1.2 million children. And I think that just says it all, okay? Dispelled the myth of vaccines and autism. Okay, so autism impacts in two core areas within the DSM-5. We are looking at social and communication issues, and we're looking at behaviour issues, and that is the diagnosis for autism, and that's what the questionnaires, the observations and the interviews are based on. We're looking at restricted and repetitive behaviour patterns. We're looking at social and communication issues. So we're going to take them one at a time. We're going to start with social and communication. Now this is split into three. The reciprocity, the back and forth conversation, the non-verbal behaviour, the lack of eye contact, and also lack of building relationships. If I'm going too fast, slow me down, yes.
Can I ask, is this a link with linguistic abilities? I mean, they don't communicate because they don't have the linguistic
No, it's the social.
It's completely social.
Yeah. Actually, I can show you some research actually when we're looking at prevalence, and it's very different in Caucasians than it is in Hispanics and I don't know what the technical term is these days, blacks. So yeah, I don't know. There's a PhD in there.
Another question. When you talked about the different symptoms from mild to severe, what is the distribution? Are the children more with severe impairment or mild, or is it like evenly distributed?
I think it's evenly distributed. Okay, so number 1, social and emotional reciprocity. How are you all doing today? How are you doing today?
Cool, I'm good.
You're good. How are you doing today? How are you doing today? Yeah? Very good. How are you doing today? Yeah? A lot of you say, I'm fine, I'm good. Children with autism, do they say I? No. They can't express. They either will not reply to you, or they'll say, Lexi's okay today. They will always use the third person. They don't use the first person, which I think is really interesting. Yeah, they don't talk about themselves in the same way that we would. So it's an impairment of that back and forth conversation. It's a reduced sharing of interests. They just don't want to talk to you about it. Or they talk on an adult level about washing machines in such detail that it is mind-blowing. But it's repetitive. They will say the same thing over and over again. It's not free speech. It's a learned speech. It's almost like they're talking from a script. They don't understand humour, and we'll talk about that more next week, and they don't understand metaphors. So if I said it was raining cats and dogs outside, they'd be like, huh? They don't get it. Very young children are also thought, parents sometimes think they have hearing problems because you might repeat their name over and over again and they just ignore you. Yeah, they're just not interested. They don't want that conversation. So social and emotional reciprocity. This is the same with language impairment as well. And this depends generally on their level of ASD. Very high functioning individuals will probably have incredible vocabularies actually. You know, their words are amazing. Whereas those who are more on the profound, particularly if they also have a diagnosis of an intellectual disability, have no communication, language communication. They can communicate with sign language or with technology nowadays, but they won't have that language. Non-verbal communication and behaviour. These children don't read emotion in faces like we would. They wouldn't know if you were happy or if you were sad. If we're out for dinner, how many of you have got kids? Yeah, a couple. If you look at your kids and you're at the dinner table and you're out in a restaurant and you stare at them as if to say, stop doing that. Your kids know. Even as teachers, how many of you are TLAs or whatever, you look at your child and you go, oh. Typically developing children get that. Sorry. Children with ASD, no idea what that means. They don't read the faces. They don't read the emotion at all. There's a lack of eye contact. Yeah, they don't like looking at you. It's just something that is not ever going to change. Body language, we've said, and understanding non-verbal communication. Yes, we've said that. So that's the second one of the social and communication. The third one is developing relationships with others. Sharing. Children are bad at it at the best of times. Autistic kids just don't do it. It's mine. Yeah, they don't share. They don't use imaginative play. If I said, what could you do with a pen? You'd go, oh, I could use it as a microphone, use a hairbrush. You know, typically developing children would play with all sorts of things in different ways. They'd pick up a hairbrush and dance around the room. Kids with autism, they just don't do that. There is no imaginative play. There's no abstract thinking. Generally because there's just no interest in other people at all. They're in their own world. Which brings us to theory of mind. Now, those of you who have done psychology before will know a little bit more about this. A total lack of empathy. It's not being able to understand that other people have thoughts, ideas and feelings that can be different from your own. We use it all the time. We use it every day. It's being able to predict other people's feelings. So if I said to you guys, you're the best masters class I've ever had, you interact and you chat and you're great, that makes you feel good. And I know that makes you feel good. But if I said to you, you're the worst, guys, you are dreadful, that makes you feel bad. Okay? Children with autism, they have no feelings. That would mean nothing to them. They just don't have this understanding that you could have a feeling different from what they're feeling. So typically developing children have this understanding of theory of mind at quite an early age. So by 18 months they're looking in the mirror and they're going, oh yeah, that's me. Children with autism don't really see that. They don't know that that's them. This symbolic play, this imaginative play, children from 18 months will have this, whereas autistic children don't. And altruism, the sharing, giving a toy to another child. Children really struggle with this when they have autism. I'm going to show you, how many of you have seen the Sally Ann test before? A few of you. I'm going to show you the video of the Sally Ann test. It's quite interesting. Quite a typical test for theory of mind. Can you put yourself in somebody else's shoes? Feel what somebody else is feeling or thinking. Right, take 5 minutes. You all look like you're falling asleep. Go for a walk around, go and get a cup of coffee, and we'll come back and we'll look at the core impairments of behaviour 2 in a minute. If you've got any questions, come and ask me. Okay, just whilst we're waiting for a couple more to come back, has anybody got anything they want to share their experiences on social interactions? Anybody who's working with kids? No? Okay. Right, the next core area is all about behaviour. So the DSM has 2 core areas. The first one is social and communication. The second one is behaviour. And this is all about repetitive and restrictive patterns of behaviour and interests. Now, children with ASD have to have at least 2 of the following, and that is repetitive motor movements or repetitive speech. It's about routines and ritualised patterns of behaviour. We're talking about those children who have fixated interests and that intense focus, that sort of lockdown of focus. And then also that hypo or hyper reaction to sensory stimuli. So let's go through those one at a time. So we're talking about... Oh, I didn't realise there's so many of you coming back. Sorry. So I'll just flick back to that last slide. We're talking about behaviour now. And for a DSM-5 diagnosis, you need at least 2 of those 4 behaviours. I'm going to go through them anyway. So the first one is this repetitive motor movement. And it's that things like the rocking backwards and forwards. It's the hand flapping, the lining up or flipping of objects. It's humming to yourself. We've all seen it. We've all heard it, those who've worked with autism. It's also repetitive speech. and we call this echolalia. Now, the reason individuals with autism tend to do this, and the more severe individuals, you see the more severe the behaviours. But it's a form of where we would, or typically developing children would suck their thumb, or we would, pick our fingernails or bite our lips. It's a reaction to stress. It's a reaction to anxiety. And it just helps them calm themselves down, a lot of the behaviours. So the rigid language, sometimes there's no meaning at all to the language that these children use. It can be totally unrelated to the conversation that you're having, because these children tend to have scripts that they go through, that they use, which some people who wouldn't understand that they had autism would think that, oh, actually they're quite good, they're communicating. But actually they're just repeating what they've heard from a TV show. And this is generally called echolalia, and we also say things like delayed echolalia as well. And I've got a good video of a lady to talk to you about that in a minute. So echolalia is the way in which immediately you are scripted in your reply, whereas delayed echolalia is you've heard something, and it could even be up to years before, but it's the way in which you use language. So we're going to look at this video now. I'm going to actually, I'm going to stop this video and start it again. So this is a lady who has autism herself, and she's quite good at blogging about it, actually.
Welcome to this week's episode of Ask an Autistic.
Sorry, I can't turn the volume on.
This week I'm going to be discussing echolalia, specifically the two main kinds of echolalia, immediate echolalia and delayed echolalia. Immediate echolalia is what most people think of when they think of echolalia. It is the immediate repetition of words or short phrases by autistic people. So immediately after somebody says something to us or we hear it, we repeat it. Immediate echolalia is sometimes misunderstood by non-autistic people. It's been said by non-autistic people that immediate echolalia is a sign of inattention in autistic people, a sign that we are engaged with our environment, and even a sign of a lack of intelligence or an inability to learn. Like we're just parrots repeating whatever we hear. Now we know this isn't true, and that it can even be a stepping stone to generating unique or original language, speaking in a person's own words. Every autistic person is different, so I'm just going to outline a few reasons that an autistic person might use immediate echolalia. The first common use of immediate echolalia is a way to stall or buy ourselves time while we process what was just said to us. If you say something to an autistic person or ask us a question and then expect a response, there's a lot that has to happen in our brains for us to be able to make a verbal response. We have to hear what you're saying and then make an effort to understand the language you use and what exactly is that you're asking of us. And then while remembering what it is that you just asked, we have to figure out what our response is, what we think or feel in that moment, and then we have to translate our response into spoken language. So using immediate echolalia, repeating the question that was just asked of us, or a portion of the thing that somebody just said, is a way for us to buy ourselves time, while at the same time processing what was said to us and giving us time to generate our own answers. A second common reason that autistic people use immediate echolalia is interaction. Immediate echolalia can be a form of expression, which I'll talk about next. It can be a way for us to process what we're hearing and to think about what we want to say. But it can also just be a way to be present with someone and to interact. If you say to an autistic person, I had a really good time at the park today with you, and they say, I had a really good time at the park today with you, it could be that they're just expressing the same sentiment, or repeating what you said to show that they are there with you and they're listening and they want to engage with you. A third common reason that autistic people use immediate echolalia, and a reason that was actually controversial up until the 1980s, is as a form of expression, a way to say what we're thinking or to make our needs and desires known. Something to look out for when you're trying to determine if an autistic person is using immediate echolalia to try to communicate with you or ask for something is to look at their body language. So if you ask an autistic person, would you like some more salad, and they say, would you like some more salad, and hold out their plate at the same time, then chances are they are answering in the affirmative, yes, I would like some more salad. So it's important to keep an eye out for an autistic person's body language, which will give you a clue into if they are expressing themselves or asking for something when they're using immediate echolalia. Another sign that an autistic person is using immediate echolalia to express themselves or in a communicative way is if they echolalia with slight changes in the original question or sentence. So if you ask an autistic person, would you like some milk, and they respond with, would you like some juice, chances are they are saying, no, I don't want milk, I want juice. So those are three common reasons that autistic people use immediate echolalia as a way to process and buy us time while we're thinking about our response, as a way to interact and engage with people, and as a method of expression to make our needs and wants known. But immediate echolalia is also used personally by autistic people for our own reasons and not necessarily to communicate with people around us. The use of immediate echolalia can be self-soothing. If an autistic person is in a new situation or they're stressed or anxious, they might repeat comforting or familiar words or phrases to themselves just to help them get through it and to process, and also as a way to calm themselves and regulate their emotions. Immediate echolalia can also be for self-stimulation purposes, in that it's just fun. Lots of words are fun or enjoyable to say, and autistic people might use immediate echolalia personally as a way to rehearse, as a form of rehearsal. I do this quite a bit. If I'm asked a question like, are you going to church tomorrow? I might repeat quietly to myself a few times, are you going to church tomorrow? Are you going to church tomorrow? And this is me rehearsing what I'm going to say. Or it might be a parent telling their autistic child, say thank you for the gift, and they might say to themselves, say thank you for the gift, say thank you for the gift, and they could be working themselves up to saying thank you for the gift. Delayed echolalia is exactly what it sounds like. It's the repetition of words or phrases after a period of time. So hours or days or weeks or even years after the autistic person heard the original content. Delayed echolalia is also often misunderstood by non-autistic people, but for a different reason. The thing about delayed echolalia is that because a period of time has passed since the autistic person was told or heard the original content, the person listening now might not know what they're referencing. If they were there originally, they might not even remember, or they just might not have seen the movie or television show or commercial that the autistic person was echolaliating from. So in that way, the listener might not actually recognize delayed echolalia as echolalia, especially if the echolalia, if the repeated dialogue, actually fits in the current situation. I see this kind of echolalia, this delayed echolalia, quite a bit in autistic teenagers and adults, particularly autistic teens and adults, who can generally pass as neurotypical. And this is a part of their passing as neurotypical, is the use of delayed echolalia and social scripts. So this is all very closely tied in with social scripting. Again, every autistic person is different, but there are a few common reasons that an autistic person might use delayed echolalia. One reason is for communication. They might use delayed echolalia in a communicative way. For example, when asked, what did you do on the weekend, they might respond with, don't forget your swimsuit, which is something that someone said to them before they went to the pool. And so from this, the listener might be able to infer that the autistic person went to the pool on the weekend. Another example would be an autistic person being asked how they feel today, and then the autistic person repeating dialogue from a book or movie that they feel fits their current mood or what they would like to respond with. And again, this may or may not be identified as echolalia. Another common reason for the use of delayed echolalia is for routine or feeling of completion. You may have noticed that at the beginning of most, if not all of my videos, I start with, "Hi, I'm Amethyst, and welcome to this week's episode of Ask an Autistic." This is a form of delayed echolalia. It's kind of funny because this repetition is something that I originally said, so I'm repeating myself. But it is a form of echolalia, and it's a kind of comforting routine thing to stick to. I don't have to worry about how I'm going to start every video because I can just use delayed echolalia and say what I say at the beginning of pretty much every video. So after completing a task, an autistic person might say to themselves, "Good job," which is delayed echolalia that a teacher or a parent might have said to them, a phrase that meant you have just completed a task and you are done now, good job. The last example I'll give, a reason that an autistic person might use delayed echolalia is to make their needs or wants known. So Marvin might ask me, "Is there anything in particular you want to watch today?" And I might think and say, "His name is Stitch," which is a line from Lilo and Stitch. Or you might ask an autistic person where they would like to eat, and they might sing the jingle or say the slogan of a certain restaurant. In this way, we're using delayed echolalia to directly express ourselves and make our needs and wants known. Sometimes, when it comes to the expressive use of delayed echolalia, our communication efforts can be hard to decipher. For example, an autistic person might say, "Do you want some juice?" when they mean "I'm thirsty," and not necessarily for juice. Or, okay, little Amethyst story time. In my first year at summer camp, I went up to the other girls in my cabin, and I introduced myself by saying, "Amethyst means a purple stone." And what I meant was, "What are your names?" But I was using something that I had heard and said before in the present moment to try to communicate, and I was misunderstood. And in that way, it can be frustrating, especially for the autistic person trying to communicate, but also for the listener. And because autistic people think differently, and because our brains make different associations, and because sometimes the echolalia and language that we have available to us is limited, in that way we can be misunderstood by people. So depending on the context and the situation, an autistic person's use of delayed echolalia could very well be an attempt to communicate or to express themselves or interact. But again, like immediate echolalia, delayed echolalia is also used by autistic people just for ourselves personally because it's useful to us or helpful. And it's helpful and useful in much the same ways as immediate echolalia. It can be self-stimulatory or soothing to us. It can be a method of rehearsal, allowing us to figure out what we're going to say and becoming more confident before we say it. It can be situational and just for fun, and that we see a poster of a movie that we really want to see, and so we start reciting dialogue from the trailer just because it makes us happy and we enjoy thinking about it. And delayed echolalia can be a kind of what non-autistic people might call talking to yourself, a way to process your environment and what's around you and what you're thinking and feeling.
Okay. Now, I think if we're truthful, some of us use delayed echolalia as well, particularly if we're going into a job interview or if we're going to the doctors, we, rehearse what we're going to say. So it's not just autistic people that use this, but you can see, does this answer some of your question? Yeah, a little bit. It's not as though they don't have those neural networks, it's the process of thought. And I even remember my PhD when I went in for my Viva. Do you guys have Vivas for your masters? No. He said, repeat the question that they've asked you because it gives you time. And it does. If anybody asks you a really bad question, repeat it back to them so it gives you thinking time. So we all use echolalia and delayed echolalia, really. Okay. Number 2, inflexibility, I think that's going to be. Autistic kids see the world as black and white, don't they? Everything is right or it's wrong. And this leads to anxiety. Their inflexibility with what they're doing. They misread situations. They can't read situations. They don't know how to behave in certain situations. So they like everything to be the same, and if everything's the same, then they don't have to think abstractly, they don't have to see things in a different way, they don't have to change the way in which they eat the food. They like everything to be the same, and if it's not the same, this is where you get that behavioural outbursts and the temper tantrums, because things have changed and they have to process it, and the processing takes far longer in an autistic child than it would for you or I. So that is why they like things to be the same, and this is why transitions are very difficult for them. So it's just extreme. Their whole world falls apart when they have to do something in a different way. Restricted and fixated interests, they have strong attachments to unusual objects, and they have very sort of locked in sometimes approaches to particular things. They get so absorbed in what they're doing, you can call it, parents tend to call it sort of locked in. It's that inflexibility of cognitive thinking, that lack of abstract thought. I used to work with a little boy who was obsessed with soap powders. I mean, this fixation could be on anything, but it's soothing. And sometimes when you've got a child who fixates on something that can be quite dangerous, the head banging, the self-injurious behaviour, you need to change the way in which they self-soothe. And so sometimes you can actually change the objects in which they are attached to. Or you incorporate it into the child's day. We had a child who, remember in the old days, you used to get those phone books with everyone's phone number in? I'm showing my age now. We brought it into the classroom and brought it in as part of whatever we happened to be doing. So it wasn't that unusual, but it did calm the child down. And we had another one who, loved ripping paper up, which, as you can imagine, in the classroom, but we had a box, and all he needed to do was knew that that's where he could rip paper. So you can have this restricted interest, but you can channel it into a way that is actually quite soothing for the child and actually doesn't interfere too much with their everyday experiences. So hypo and hyperreactivity to all sorts of different things. All sorts of different things. They have a different ability to, as I said, process information, but this is also processing sensory information as well. They just don't tolerate the light, the sound, the heat like you or I would. And this is why they try to escape certain situations. This is why they will rock and they will put their hands over their ears or their eyes, or they'll run out of the room. It's sensory overload and they just can't deal with that. And if we look at these slides here, it really is all about intensity and this hyper reaction to sensitivity. They might seek out intense flavours because they need that intensity for it to be different. Or they might rock excessively because they need that sensation to feel something. That's the hyper, which is not as common as the hypo. Those children who will only wear the same clothes day in and day out because they feel soft. You've got to cut all the labels out of the socks because they feel them and they can't cope with that sensation. They'll only have certain types of food. I used to work with a girl who would only eat white food, which is quite limiting. But that's what she would do because she couldn't cope with the sensation of having anything else on her plate. So the textures, it's amazing what these children experience and how they go about avoiding certain objects and how it affects them. You know, the behaviours when they don't get their own way in that T-shirt. They want that same T-shirt. They don't get it. Their world falls apart because it's just too much cognitive stimulation to think about having to wear something else. Okay, you've done really well so far. I've talked for hours. We're going to do an activity. PolyU budget is IKEA and rice, I'm afraid. So get into groups. I've only got a few of these. I want you to get into groups and I want you to have a look. Now this is all about sensory overload. I've got bags of rice and in here I've got a couple of paper clips. So if we have, you might not all get to have a go, but you can have a go at the end of the lecture if need be. So sensory overload. Let's put ourselves into the mind of an autistic person. So what I want you to do is with your eyes closed, one of you in your group, reach into the bag and see what you feel. Can you differentiate between the rice and the paper clip? How are you feeling? What is going on with your senses? Okay, so take it in turns, have a little look and see how you feel. So open the bag, one of you at a time in your groups. Somebody can time you for 30 seconds. Close your eyes and see how many paper clips you can feel. Some of you might be able to do it easily. Some of you might not. I'm not going to give you any more clues than that. Okay, who's got a bag? You have to form bigger groups. You turn around and see. You're in the group there. There's quite a few of you there. Choose who's going to go first. Yeah, you've got one there. Right, guys, here. Back there. Back behind you. Who's going to have a go in this group here? Take that. Close your eyes. I find this impossible. I can never get anything on with them. And just pass it round, make sure everyone can see if everyone can have a go. You don't have to do 30 seconds, it's quite a lot of you. You can even just do a few seconds, see how you feel. Don't worry about the 30 seconds. Put your fingers in. So many of you. Okay, if you're finding it really difficult to feel the paper clips, you are not alone. Everyone feels it's really difficult. It is. Those of you who've got to go, it is incredibly difficult. And this is what autistic people feel all the time. They are being bombarded with all of this sensory information that they just can't see. Has anybody found it easy yet? No? Okay, I'll give you another few minutes. Okay, those of you who are still going, but I'll just explain why I've done that. Okay, so the tactile receptors in your fingers get so overloaded with information, they can't feel the difference between the rice and the paperclip. And this is what it's like for an autistic person. They're being bombarded with so much information that they just cannot cope with the world. So how many of you had strategies? Did anybody develop a strategy for filtering out some of that, well, the rice or the sensory information? Anybody sort of put it into a pile and then take out the paper chips? No, nobody had it. You? Yeah?
I just use more time. I take more time to do like this.
Yeah. So this is what autistic children have to do. They have to filter the information, and this is why they cover their ears, they close their eyes, they put their hand in front of the face as a way of being able to differentiate between the different stimulations. So this escape behaviour, this avoidance behaviour is like the filtering of the rice and the paper. Okay, you can still play with the rice. Okay, I want to watch a video, and this is of a boy who is autistic. He is a teenager, and he is. So that is sort of getting. Go.
Sorry, I didn't get the part about seeing.
Oh, so she was saying the self-injurious behaviours. Yeah. So she would we'd call it stereotypy. So repetitive behaviours. She would call it stibbing or stibbing. It's just an American version thereof. But self-stimulatory, as opposed to self-injurious, which is SIB. It's very similar. But we all have these acronyms for everything. So yeah, stibbing, sieving, and self-injurious behaviour and everything else. Okay, so let's go back to some DSM classifications. Now, you do need a psychiatrist or a clinical psych to diagnose you with ASD. And it is based on the DSM-5 nowadays, and even, I'm going to show you two, I'm not going to show you the actual questionnaires because they are massive, but it is all based on observations and interviews and history as well. But also, and we're going to talk about comorbidity in a minute, other illnesses and other conditions is not just about diagnosing the autism, it's about what else do they have as well. Okay, at the moment, our current diagnostic strategy depends on clinical observations. And because of this, we really are not picking people up until about the age of 4. Yeah? Not many people will get a diagnostic certificate of autism before the age of 4. It can happen as early as 2, but generally that's in families where you've already got one autistic child already. But this is going to change, and it's already changing with the research that we have out there at the moment. So early identification is the key with autism, and certainly with the prognosis of autism. If you can get in early, you can give these children the skills in which to communicate. You can give them the social scripts. You can teach them the delayed echolalia for them to even pass as neurotypical. So it's all about teaching them and getting those brain connections working. If we can get those children from a very early age, we can develop those neural networks in the brain. Remember, autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder. It's because the connections aren't there. If we can develop them, we're halfway there to getting these children to communicate and to understand the sensory information. Now, this is some wonderful research that has been happening. Let's see if we can get it. So it's quite amazing how the eye trackers move from looking at autism, the eyes are all over the place, and then are typically developing is quite fixated on an individual's eyes. And if that wasn't amazing enough, this research came out 3 months ago. Have a little look at it. It is going to be incredible. If the eye tracking was talking about picking people up or picking babies up at sort of 1, 2, 3 months, this is going to be picking people up or babies up, possibly even in vitro. It looked at only 149 children so far who had ASD. They followed them up a year later, and they've found an algorithm that they can use using a blood test that picked up with an 88% accuracy that these children were going to have develop autism. So do you think in the next sort of 5 years' time you're going to be coming out of hospital knowing if your child has or is going to develop autism? It'd be like a Down syndrome test. It's incredible. And then at 1 month old, 2 month old, we can start doing this ABA. We can start doing the interventions and getting those neural networks working. So I think this type of research is just on the cusp of revolutionising how we understand autism. And next week we're going to look into the interventions of autism as well. And if we can do those so much earlier, you're not wasting those first 4 years of life, those first 5 years of life. So obviously this is a very small study, but it has had a follow-up, and it's, you know, once we get the clinical trials in there, this is going to be the stuff you're going to be watching. But an 88% accuracy rate on an algorithm on a blood test is incredible. However, that is not readily available at the moment, so we are still looking at observations using the DSM-5. But this might change by the time you guys are clinicians or whatever you're doing. Okay, so the DSM has 3 levels of autism. The first level is the more highly functioning, how we would normally or used to have been called Asperger's. Someone who has a level 1 diagnosis only requires minimum support. Minimum support. They are very highly functioning. They usually have language. They might have problems with social interaction, but it's not severe. Their repetitive and restrictive behaviours don't really interfere with their daily functioning. Somebody who is on the level 2, you can see quite readily those deficits in social interactions. They are using repetitive behaviours, using repetitive language, and they get very distressed when they are interrupted. Someone on a level 3 diagnosis will be requiring substantial support from others. They will have severe deficits in verbal and social communication. They are more likely to be non-verbal as well and have no communication. They have very limited interactions and responses to others. They have very restricted and locked-in obsessions, which interferes with all of their functioning. So those are the 3 levels within the DSM. But how much further? Okay. I'm going to talk about rating scales and then I'll give you another 5 minutes. So the rating scales that we generally use within psychiatry and psychology are the ADOS and the CARS. The ADOS, has anybody used the ADOS and the CARS? No? The Autism Development and Observation Scale, which is now the gold standard. If anybody is asked to diagnose somebody, they would generally use the ADOS. There is a lot of training involved if you want to be able to use the ADOS. And then the CARS, which is the Childhood Autism Rating Scale. So the ADOS only came in 2000. It is now available in 15 different languages. It has amazing reliability and validity with the DSM-5. Depending on your severity of autism will depend on the module in which you are tested. So it's very much with that line of DSM 1, 2 or 3 on the severity of your symptoms. It usually takes about 45 minutes, depending on the severity, depends on the behavioural issues of the child. It has great inter-rater reliability and test-retest reliability. So if I tested you guys today and I tested you 6 months' time and another 6 months, you'll still get the diagnosis of autism or not. And if you guys tested and you guys tested me, you'd all say that I had autism or I didn't. Okay, so the test-retest and inter-rater is great. And there's fantastic consistency, differentiation between ASD and non-ASD groups. It has a validity, is measuring ASD. The CARS used to be the gold standard, but since the ADOS came out, fewer and fewer people are using the CARS, but the ADOS does take an awful lot more training. What I will say about the ADOS is it comes in a huge big box and it is an observation as well. It's not just a questionnaire. A child would be asked something like, or there'll be a pattern on the table and they have to fill in the pattern with blocks, but the child's not given enough blocks. But they can see the blocks, I have the blocks, but you're not given the blocks. How does the child react? Do they scream? Do they shout? Do they sit there? Is there any communication? Do they ask politely if they can have another block? Okay, so there's a lot going on. It's not just about a questionnaire or an observation. There's a lot of interaction going on, and you are marked on how that particular individual reacts with the examiner, as it were. So the CARS you can only use from children over 2 years of age. It's 15 items. It is a questionnaire and an observation tool. It's only marked from 1 to 4 on a severity 4-point scale on the items. But it is interesting, and it gives you a level of severity from non-autistic mildly to severely autistic. Trying to get your hands on an ADOS or a car is very difficult. They do cost a fortune, and within the department they didn't have one to give to me. Okay, so I can't show you that, but what I'd like you to have a little look at, if you get your phones out, is the Childhood Autism Spectrum Test. You can do it on yourself, do it on your child, do it on somebody who's make-believe, but what I want you to think about is the questions that they're asking and how that relates to the DSM-5 and what you've learnt in class. You can talk amongst yourselves whilst you're doing it, but just have a look. Think about the questions. How is that relating to social communication? It is for more highly functioning. It used to be more of the Asperger's. And then we'll take a 5-minute break. We'll nearly get going. So we're just going to run through development, comorbidity, prevalence and prognosis, and then we are done for today. I've lost my place now. There we go. Okay, now I think we've probably run through this a few times in what I've said anyway, so I don't want to go over it too much. And actually I want to show you another video of a more highly functioning child and their development and what the mother noticed as the symptoms of the child. It's quite interesting actually. But infant development, you can see that there is no big smile like a typically developing child would have. Those expressions aren't there. We've talked about that back and forth expression. It's not there for children. Now, you and I would get this. Some parents just don't see it and don't understand it. So it's very important for people to know the signs and symptoms. So we've said all of that. We've said about the lack of gestures, of pointing, that theory of mind just doesn't quite develop, and very stilted language if language does develop, and quite robot-like sometimes. When we're getting to toddler development, it's a real delay in spoken language. Some children are talking in full sentences by like 18 months, 2 years. These children typically don't unless they are very highly functioning. We're beginning to see these repetitive patterns of behaviours, particularly with toys, unusual objects, playing with objects in a very different way from typically developing children. You're beginning to see this limited interest in their focus and what they want to play with and talk about. And you're beginning to see, even at a very early age, this sensory avoidance behaviour because everything is just too much. And this is where the rigidity starts, with only eating certain foods, only wanting to wear certain clothes. And if this is upset, we then get those temper tantrums. And normal children have temper tantrums. These are just a whole lot worse because you can't hug them or hold them or calm them down or reason with them. Okay, it's got to be almost on their own terms, as it were. So by the time we get to preschool, parents are beginning to seek out help. They're looking at their child, they're looking at other people's child, and they're thinking, oh, there's something not quite right here. So we're seeing those temper tantrums and the more problematic behaviours. They're noticing that their child isn't sharing in the same way. So we've spoken about that. I'm not going to go over it again. And then as time goes on, we see far more social isolation as the children get older. They're not making those friends. They're not understanding how to interact. They're getting teased. And this is where a lot of bullying happens and that victimisation as they're going on, and even into sort of the end of primary school into secondary school. And this is where, we're talking about last week, do you have these special schools, or do you educate these children in, within everybody else? It's such a difficult area. The anxieties that go with it, and we'll see when we talk about the comorbidity, the anxieties are huge in these children. The other coexisting mental health problems, the ADHD that goes with it, it's not just dealing with autism generally. So I'm going to show you very quickly this video, but you can see, such a cute kid, but you can see that learnt language as opposed to, that interaction, spontaneous language. How many people would pick that up normally? How many mothers would know that those were signs of autism? They just wouldn't. Okay, it is so subtle in some cases, so subtle. Okay, let's move on to comorbidity. Now this I find is just really sad. 3/4 of all ASD have other medical issues, and these we call comorbidities. They can happen at any time during child development. They come and they can go sometimes depending on the interventions that the child gets. Some might not appear until later adolescence and adulthood, and this is some of the sort of more of the anxieties. But you need to understand to get the interventions working for that particular child. So it's very easy to kind of group it all together, but you need the intervention specifically for whatever comorbidities that these children have. So there are a number of overlapping disorders. It isn't just within neurodevelopmental disorders. Intellectual disabilities are high, language disorders are high, learning disabilities, ADHD and anxiety. You can see there 2/3 of children with ASD behaviours are also incredibly similar to ADHD, which provides, that's really difficult for diagnosing ADSD and AHD as well, with reliability and validity issues. Anxiety is incredibly common in individuals with ASD. Up to 84% of people have anxiety problems, and then that comes back to the repetitive behaviours, the self-injurious behaviours, as a way, a mechanism of coping. We can see that 27% of teenagers with less severe ASD also have bipolar disorder, which we used to call that manic depressive disorder. So they have bouts of depression and they have bouts of mania as well. We've also seen that 17% also have Down syndrome. So yet another genetic issue on top of autism. And then, as I said before, they have these gastrointestinal issues as well, which is why originally they thought that it was diet that was causing these issues. We can see that within the families there's a lot of history with autoimmune diseases, there's intellectual disabilities as well, and the obsessive compulsive comes out with those ritualistic behaviours, those repetitive thoughts, repetitive behaviours. Epilepsy is hugely common in people with ASD. And then 11% of ASD also have the Tourette syndrome as well. So you can see that there is an awful lot going on. It's not just the ASD. There are so many other issues as well. And if we can get the ASD early and we can get that diagnosed, we can understand the other influences and the impacts, particularly with things like anxiety, particularly as they get older, giving them ways and means to deal with their anxieties. So understanding autism and understanding the comorbidities, gives us help in the interventions that we're going to talk about next week. Okay, we're nearly finished. Okay, prevalence. About 1 in 42 boys and about 1 in 189 girls have ASD, and we don't know why. We don't know why that happens. White and Caucasian children are far more likely to be identified with autism than black and Hispanic children. I've got no idea on the prevalence of within Asia. In fact, I don't think we even know what the stats are. So, looking at that, 1 in 63 white children, that's 1 in 81 black children, 1 in 93 Hispanic children, has got to be about the genetic mutations and how they work. But why is there an increase? What's going on? Well, do we know? If you can answer this question, you'll probably be a multimillionaire. Yeah. One of the ideas is that we can swap the diagnosis now. Individuals who were getting a diagnostic category as an intellectual disability, we are now saying that they have autism. And also genetic susceptibility, like I said at the beginning, more older males are having babies with younger females, more younger females are having babies. There's an awful lot going on with the genetics as well. And I've got one slide here that just shows the difference. Oh God, it hasn't come out very well, has it? So this is 2000, so not really that long ago in the grand scheme of things. If you look at the diagnostic categories there's an awful lot more people being picked up with autism. And I don't think that's because there are more autistic children. I think it is we're just changing the labels around, fundamentally.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Is it also people have enhanced their awareness?
Absolutely. And I think as well is, I don't know how it works here as much, but certainly in the UK, you needed that diagnosis of autism to get the money, to get the funding, to get the help. So it's something that you push for to get. I don't know what health insurance is like here with getting money for autism, but it's certainly something. Definitely. So lastly, we're just going to talk about prognosis. There's just not one answer. We don't know how every child is going to turn out because every child is different because of, why they've got autism in the first place. There's not one kind of autism. Each and every one of them is unique. We also have to think about their other conditions as well with regard to the prognosis. So we need to understand and diagnose the medical issues or the other mental health issues in order to help those as well and not misdiagnose them. A lot of ASD children get misdiagnosed as just having ADHD. So, we've got to find the right diagnosis in the first place. There is no cure for autism yet. I'm sure one day maybe there will be, who knows. And in some cases, with intervention, some children have actually had their ASD label removed because they are so much better at interacting. We're going to look at the intensive treatments next week. Some children do acquire speech that haven't had it before with ABA therapy or floor time. So the earlier we get it, the better the prognosis, because you, as I said, you can change those neural networks. You can give people the social scripts in order that you will pass the neurotypical. So some experts believe that having an IQ above 50 will help with the prognosis. Being able to speak before the age of 6 and having a useful skill. So if you put that energy into some art, we've got some amazing autistics who are art geniuses. You've got some autistics who are fantastic mathematicians or physicists. If we can put that into a useful skill, the prognosis is an awful lot better. But again, this is generally in the highly functioning. Where did we get to? I think children with autism are fewer now are being placed in institutions, and certainly we're not seeing those secure units that we used to see. They are staying within society an awful lot more than they used to, and we're understanding it an awful lot better, and it's not that negativity as it would have been even 30 years ago. So getting that early diagnosis, getting that treatment, we really can reduce the symptoms of autism. So how many of you actually did watch the video? There's a few of you. I'm going to play it again because it's one of those videos that I've watched about 1,000 times, and I found this just kind of brings together everything that we've learned today. It is on the website. If you've seen it and you want to go, I totally understand that you've got best things to do with your time. But if you want to watch it again, I really would like you to. It is a long video. It's a good 10 minutes or so. Should we take attendance now? Let's do that. And then we'll watch the video. Oh, I need to set it up. Hold on a second, I will get you a... I'll get you a code, hold on. Let me just log in. What's your course code? $50.55? Okay, L4748.